So with that, I'm happy to set the stage for our next session. So previous research has shown that in addition to reducing levels of CO2 released into the atmosphere, carbon capture systems can reduce air pollution for millions of Americans as well. In August, the Great Plains Institute and Carbon Solutions released a first-of-its-kind study that evaluates the health benefits and economic value of capturing co-pollutants in representative carbon capture facilities in 7 industries across 10 regions in the United States. You're about to hear a presentation on our research findings, followed by a panel discussion about their significance for carbon management and future research. So I'm pleased to welcome our panelists up to the stage: Patrice Lahlum, Vice President of Carbon Management at GPI, Matt Fry, Senior Policy Manager at GPI, Shannon Heyck-Williams, Associate Vice President of Climate and Energy at the National Wildlife Foundation, and John Thompson, Technology and Markets Director at the Clean Air Task Force.
Morning, everybody. How are you? See if I can operate this thing. Hey, there we go. So as Bridget mentioned this morning, we're going to talk a little bit about improving air quality. As she mentioned, we did an analysis that looks at the co-benefits of installations of carbon capture technologies on industrial and thermal energy facilities across the country. So just going to talk a little bit about what we learned from that analysis and the report that we presented. So the first thing I'll talk about is the motivation for the report. As we read the news, we talk with folks, there's a significant lack or chasm of information, if you will, about what carbon capture is, what it can do, and how it can benefit public and communities. So our goal was to actually perform an analysis that quantified what some of these potential benefits were, both to the environment and to communities and health in general. So as we see here, carbon capture can be more than just a climate solution. We say it can be because you actually have to implement carbon capture technologies before it can benefit these populations and these people. As Bridget mentioned in her opening, removing co-pollutants improves air quality and reduces health impacts. We'll talk about that a little bit more in future slides. But we were able to quantify these with our colleagues at Carbon Solutions. And then improved air quality can lead to substantial, sorry, I haven't had enough coffee yet this morning, substantial economic benefits related to better health. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our study approach. The intent of this conversation is not to dig deep into the weeds. This is a very technical analysis and report. So that's not the goal of this conversation. Previous presentations we had on this are, an hour plus just for the analysis. So we're not going to dig deep into the methodologies and the data utilized. If you folks want to talk more about this, our research manager, Ryan Cameron, standing in the back there, and the analytical team is over there from Carbon Solutions. Feel free to reach out to them during a break or any other time so they can dig really deep into numbers, but that's not the intent this morning. So for this slide, we've made it very simple. We broke out our study approach into 4 basic principles. First, as you might imagine, you have to figure out where your emission sources are, what emissions you're actually going to analyze in a report like this. We use publicly available data, EPA inventories, to figure out generally what the categories of emission sources would be, and then break those out further into what the representative emissions that we would dig deeper into in our analysis. As Bridget, I think, mentioned, we had 54 facilities across 12 regions, is that right, to dig into, and I'll show a figure of that here in a little bit. The next thing that we did using Carbon Solutions Concord tool, once again, talk with them about that. I'll mess it all up, so talk with Carbon Solutions about that analytical tool. But we use that to figure out the cost of the different capture and pretreatment, processes, if you will. The reality of this analysis is that we looked at an amine solvent solution for carbon capture. Amine solvents do more than just capture CO2. So if you introduce another pollutant, criteria pollutant, like we looked at nitrogen oxides, sulfur oxides, and particulate matter, they cause problems with your carbon capture facilities. The particulate matter is a solid, so it creates sludge in the amine solvent facility, which binds up the process and makes it less efficient and causes significant problems. The NOx and SOx they actually bind to the amine solvents just like a CO2 would. The challenge is on the back end when you heat the amine solvent to release the CO2 and capture it, those NOx and SOx aren't released because they have a higher affinity heat than the CO2 does. So you basically reduce the efficiency and the effectiveness of your amine solvent solution. We also used amine solvents because those are the technologies that are available at market scale, and we chose the solvent that we did because there's data available. People are pretty secretive about their amine solvents, if you will, so the actual capture efficiencies and the costs associated with those aren't readily shared. So we utilized an amine solvent where that is shared. So once you figure out the cost of these front-end processes, we moved into what the emission reductions would be based on very conservative analysis. These emission reduction technologies are very well established. They've been used for a long time to remove NOx, SOx, and PM, and they can actually remove these pollutants at a higher level than we analyzed. But we wanted to be conservative, so we didn't overpromise and underdeliver. So as you can see from that bar chart there, the reductions in these emissions once pretreatment is done before the amine solvent, I don't know what the p-value is, but I would guess it's significant, but nonetheless, it's substantial what we're reducing these emissions by prior to going into CO2 removal. And then the last thing that we did was figure out or quantify what the health benefits were associated with these emission reductions using the EPA's COBRA tool. So not, once again, going to dig too deep into what our study results were, but I think this map's pretty telling. As you can see across all regions of the country, you see pretty substantial reductions or reductions in air quality, once again, not enough coffee. Improvements in air quality and improvements in health benefits. There's quite a bit of variability as you look across the country. There's a number of reasons for that, but just simply today we'll talk about the fact that not every region has a representative facility. For instance, there's not a lot of ethanol or any ethanol produced in the northeast part of the country, so those facilities weren't represented in this. In different parts of the country have different populations. So as you look at different population densities, places where there's more people, there's more opportunities to improve their health benefits just because there are more people. So keeping this in mind, you're looking at tens to hundreds of millions of dollars of health benefits associated with these carbon capture installations just based on those criteria pollutant removals. And these are the selected 54 facilities that we looked at across the country. So you're looking tens to hundreds of millions for 54 representative facilities. And just something to keep in mind, these are the facilities that we looked at across the country. So if we were to incorporate these types of reductions on just a fraction of the facilities across the country, we could look at some pretty significant to huge impacts and benefits on health for people in general and communities across the country. So with that, I think we'll open it up to the panel, and I appreciate y'all's time.
Thanks, Matt, for setting the stage for this conversation, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here bright and early and ready for another day of great conversation. I will start off also by saying that this type of research is something that was new for our team. We really appreciate the collaboration with Carbon Solutions and their technical experts as we kind of delved into this. And I think one of the things that I want all of us to be thinking about, and I'm sure we'll hear from John and Shannon too, about what more we can and should do to understand the potential co-benefits of carbon capture equipment applications across the country. So to start off, though, I do want to turn to Shannon and John just to kind of get their opening framing remarks and reactions to this work. So Shannon, let's start with you.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Hope you're waking up. I'm getting there myself. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today and speak on this really important topic. And it's been so great learning from all of you over the last day and a half or so, and you know, hearing all of the wonderful things you all have to say, both at dinner and on the other panels that we've been enjoying. So what Matt presents here today and in the paper that everyone has worked so hard on is certainly very good news. And I know news maybe isn't the right way to phrase that, since, as he mentioned, this type of knowledge has actually been present for a while, that carbon capture equipment can reduce criteria air pollution, but I think in the larger community and even in our community, it maybe isn't as well known. So I appreciate the work that has gone into helping make that information more known, and then also adding that quantification of health benefits, which is so important. Despite significant successes in our country in reducing air pollution since the passage of the Clean Air Act in 1970, we obviously have a long way to go still. There are certain areas that are still really plagued by air pollution problems, and really have dangerous levels of air pollution. In fact, an estimated 100,000 people in this country die prematurely every year because of air pollution, which is somewhat surprising. And particulate matter, NOx and SOx, cause a variety of health problems. We've heard a lot about lung ailments, and that's certainly a huge part of it. It can also affect the heart, neurological systems. I mean, it's even been linked potentially to some mood disorders, IQ, so it's really quite a pervasive threat. And it even weakens our ability to fight off infections like COVID, so something that we all are concerned about, of course. And for an organization like National Wildlife Federation, my organization, it's also of concern because it can hinder the ability of people to enjoy the outdoors. And as an organization that represents hunters and anglers and outdoor enthusiasts of all stripes, that's something that we want to tackle. And of course, runaway climate change makes all of this worse, as it does for everything pretty much. Whether it's extreme heat, making, fueling more kind of ground level ozone formation, whether it's megafires contributing even additional particulate matter to the air, or the reduction in green space, which lowers our ability to filter out some of these pollutants. All of that is an added concern. And these health threats, though, are not really felt universally, uniformly across the country. They're far more pernicious in certain neighborhoods that host a significant number of industry, fossil fuel-based energy generation, and transportation corridors, and even combined sometimes, which makes things even harder for residents. And all too often, the history of such infrastructure development, as we heard a lot about yesterday, has really involved building in communities that are already structurally marginalized by race-based redlining, and where residents have had really insufficient power and resources to be able to change their outcomes. So these environmental justice communities may suffer layers of compounded neglect from officials, cumulative health risks from a list of pollutants that include the ones we're hearing about today, and not to mention the added threats from climate change itself when it comes to flooding or other illnesses and loss of life and property. So given all of this, it is definitely very positive that a climate solution, such as carbon capture, can do more than just sequester, capture carbon and then for sequestration or other reuse, that has these other health benefits. That's really tremendous. Increasingly, I think that climate solutions will be looked at to see what else they can provide, what else they can do for society. We have so much other issues and compounding issues to deal with. And so therefore, I think it's fair to say that carbon capture can help meet Justice 40 goals, and this is why the administration has included a variety of carbon management tools as part of that strategy. And any improvement is important. However, and you probably knew that was coming, we should also recognize, though, and keep in context that carbon capture, use, and storage is not a panacea when it comes to addressing air quality. And we already know it isn't for addressing climate change, of course, so it stands to reason that it's not a silver bullet for addressing air quality, too. And in certain places in particular, it will leave a lot of pollution behind. That's not to say that we don't go down this path, that we don't do what is necessary. Every bit helps. And in fact, this is a special opportunity for the CCUS industry to have this information and be able to help socialize it. This technology can help clean up the industry in multiple ways, as well as bolster the reputation of the technology itself, and can help eventually, I hope, with a social license to operate. So, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Shannon. And we'll dig in deeper to some of what you shared here in a little bit. John?
Well, good morning, everyone. Congratulations, Matt and team, on a great report on co-benefits, and I'm really glad that it's getting the publicity it deserves. I want to just make a couple of points before we dig into a more moderated discussion. And a lot of the points I'm going to make are really coming out in a report that we're doing, maybe releasing in about a month or so. It's very similar, looking at cement plants and cat crackers at refineries, 4 different ones in 2 different states. And the first point that we noticed in our work that kind of follows on this topic is that there's a trade-off between the co-benefits and the cost of capture. So for the facilities we looked at, those plants that are dirtiest, those plants that gain the most benefits from the pretreatment, are also the most expensive ones to do because of those pretreatment costs. So the greater the benefits, the higher the cost. Conversely, if you have plants that are cleaner and require less pretreatment, their capture costs are less. So that's important, I think, from a couple of standpoints. When you think about the $85 a ton 45Q, the threshold question we have to ask ourselves is that going to be enough to incentivize companies to install this equipment in the situations where it matters most? Because obviously, closer to the source, the cheaper the cost, but all things being equal, the dirtier the source, the more pretreatment, the higher the capture cost, the need to be either above, to make sure that those costs are below $85. Otherwise, they don't do it. They don't do it. So what that might suggest to us from a policy standpoint is re-examining 45Q and maybe making some adjustments from inflation. As many of you know, the 45Q doesn't ratchet up with inflation until 2026 or 2027. And in the last few years, we've had a lot of inflation that's eroded that value. So again, if what we're trying to do is to install this stuff and we want to put it on some of these dirtiest facilities where the capture cost might be highest, all things being equal, then adjusting for inflation makes sense. But even in those situations, we may need to look at other policies to drive this technology ahead. Because if you can imagine, even in situations where $85 is enough to cover the installation of carbon capture and storage at a facility, it might only do so with a very small rate of return, small positive IRR of 1, measured in single digits. For a lot of these companies, they want to be at 15% or more internal rate of return. So we need to look at maybe policies like emission limits, because if you look at that, as we're doing in 111 on power plants, it changes sort of the economic perspective for these companies. If you have to do this anyway, a slightly positive IRR or a slightly negative IRR, internal rate of return, doesn't really matter as much. But if you have to do this entirely as an incentive and you're thinking about what other investments you might make, you might have to make a higher rate of return. So all these things, I think, factor into this question of co-benefits. How do we pay for it? How do we get them installed on plants so that we realize these health benefits?
Thanks, John. And maybe to kick off a more moderated discussion and just a sort of a general question to you both. Co-benefits is and interesting, and I think we need to have more conversation about co-benefits broadly. And John, you know, you touched on the research that you're all going to be releasing at CATF in the next month, but would like to hear from both of you about how your organizations are engaged in co-benefits research and also communicating about co-benefits to a broader group of stakeholders.
Let's go with you first.
Okay. Well, NWF is not a think tank, so we don't do typically a whole lot of the really deep analytical number crunching or modeling, although sometimes we do. But what we do is we take the really important information from colleagues such as these here, and we turn that into advocacy positions and policy recommendations, and then mobilize our membership. We have over 7 million members, and at National Wildlife Federation, we are a membership-based organization, and sort of activate them when we can to speak out and speak up to their neighbors, to their local and federal elected officials. And so we use that evidence-based research that others are putting out there to really help address big problems. And we tend to try to focus our efforts on solutions that can achieve multiple sort of cross-cutting benefits, more to the point of kind of the co-benefit conversation here. Obviously, on climate change, there's a whole lot to work on. But just given the nature of our organization as sort of fundamentally a conservation-based one, we approach things, of course, through the lens of wildlife conservation and biodiversity, but also environmental justice and just environmental contamination more generally. And so any time that we can sort of identify one of those solutions in the climate space, for example, that can address additional sort of ills in society, then we tend to try to focus our efforts there. And then a lot of what we are doing, especially in this era of implementation of the two big pieces of legislation recently passed, is try to get the word out. So through our network of Federation affiliates, which are all independent organizations across the country in each state and a couple of territories, host conversations, do public education through our members and other sort of partner networks to help sort of inform the conversation on these important issues.
And as I mentioned, we'll be releasing a report on refineries and cement. Our work really focused deeply on understanding the flue emissions in those specific plants. I want to just touch a little deeper on that and then talk about additional steps after that report is released. What we found, at least the way we approached this, was really not to put the pretreatment, the SCRs, the quenching, the sulfur polishing, any kind of wet ESP on our proposed plans. We would only do that only if it was needed to protect the amine. So it was a very conservative analysis. And in some cases, we didn't have to put all the NOx equipment on because they already had it on some of the refineries. And that lowered the cost. So I think one of the things that we're sort of interested in is trying to understand really in practice what are the pretreatment steps that these facilities are going to put in when it comes to the plant themselves. And we actually, in some of the things like the Tundra application for a coal plant in North Dakota, they have most of the pretreatment that we imagined in our study, but maybe not all of it on NOx. So I think NOx is going to be the challenging one. A lot of it depends, and I just want to touch on one aspect of this. Not all species of NOx interact with the amine at the same way. So there's NO, and it's not water soluble. It passes right through. That's one species of NOx. The other is NO2, and that does interact with the amine. And so the fraction that you have in the stack of those two gases varies across facilities. For some of our cat crackers and refineries, 40% of the NOx interacts with the amine, and it had to be removed. But for a natural gas combined cycle plant, it's also about 40%, and it would have to be removed. But on a coal plant, it's only like 5%. So what we actually see in the real world will be interesting to tell. Then I'd say just other kind of research issues that will be important is the volatile organic, the VOCs, volatile organic compounds, that are emitted as a part of the absorber on the cleanup equipment. The permits that we see out in the field tend to overestimate probably what is actually going to be emitted, maybe by a factor of 5 or 10, because they always set the permit levels pretty high. And I'm worried about how communities are going to look at that. They're still low overall, but it's an increase. I think in practice, the increase is going to be a lot less, and we can see that in some of the applications that have already been done, like Petronova. But that'll be an interesting area for research.
Thanks, John and Shannon. So, clearly we're talking about VOCs, we're talking about, NOx, SOx, particulate matter. Living and working in a community and having conversations about energy technologies, how do we approach conversations and socializing information or facts about the potential for co-benefits through carbon management technologies and, frankly, other energy technologies? What steps do we need to take?
Okay, I guess I'll go first, sure. So I guess I'll start by saying what I think a lot of us have maybe already recognized and talked about over the last day or so is that it's really hard. It's really hard to take, very difficult to take very complicated, somewhat arcane topics, and especially in the context of emerging science and understanding, and communicate that out in a very, plain English sort of way with ordinary residents of different affected neighborhoods or any other person you might want to talk to, whether it's at Thanksgiving or otherwise. But it's so important to continue to try to do this at all levels and in every way that each of us has sort of access to a broader network of people. I think as we've learned a lot over the last couple days, not only how you say something matters, the language you use, whether you're relying a lot on jargon that sort of presents a barrier to folks that are not in the initiated sort of in-crowd on the topic, that matters. The messengers also really matter, and any use of intermediaries can often be helpful to help build that trust in the communication process so that people might be more open to receiving new information. But I think also really important to remember, and again, as we've heard over the last day or so, is that it really is a two-way street. It's a challenge to be able to share out information, but also remember that we're also in a position of needing to receive as well and to listen. It will not only help us understand how our information may be received, but also it might really lend itself to key important concerns and topics to pursue in further research, for example, or to better understand the full context of something. Every amount of sharing that we do has to be accompanied by a healthy amount of listening as well. I think we really need to meet people as much as we can where they are. Are these pollutants that we are so eager to excited to talk about actually pollutants of concern to ordinary residents in an affected community? Are there other sources of pollution? Might they be interacting with each other? And then also really importantly, I think a lot of folks want to know, are there immediate benefits, health benefits, other sorts of benefits from what we're talking about, from installation of this technology? I think often in the climate context, right, it's hard to say that there's immediate benefit. Typically it's long-term, and we're talking about atmospheric pools, right, of pollution. But air quality has the potential, right, to, if you address it, to have a more immediate benefit. So talk about that. And then also whether the outcomes are likely to be reliable and consistent. I think people are interested to know that as well, based on experience that we've had talking at the community level.
So my view on how communities react and how we need to socialize these technologies of carbon capture and storage when they're first proposed really centers on this. I think that each community has deeply held values, and they're not the same in each community that's looking at a proposed carbon capture and storage facility. For some communities, the deeply held value is the future of their children and whether they're going to have jobs and whether they can stay in the area that they were raised in, or whether the need for economic, for jobs will take them elsewhere. In some communities, that deeply held value is the land, and eminent domain is something that causes great hardship and resistance to carbon capture. In other communities, the pollution might be so large that anything that reduces that is a deep concern. So the co-benefits of carbon capture and storage, to me, float on the surface of these deeply held values. And our challenge in socializing carbon capture and storage is really how do we connect to those deeper values? I think that health benefits sometimes is one of those deeply held values, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's something different. And our challenge is really to make the connection for this technology to those values. So in that way, I see co-benefits and the safety of CCS as sort of a necessary, but oftentimes not sufficient step in winning support in these communities. If they perceive it's unsafe, or if they don't see the value of their health improving, it's probably not going to sell. But if you can connect to, if the message does resonate with them, I think it allows the opportunity to connect to these other values, whether it's jobs, whether it's other things. And I think the challenge is that a lot of critics of CCS have done in places like Iowa a better job of connecting to concerns like eminent domain than we have with connecting to other family values or other values in those communities. But in any case, safety is really key. And I believe that the best way to talk about the co-benefits isn't to talk necessarily about reducing sulfur emissions by 99%, which it does, or PM, which in our experience is probably in the 95% reduction, or those kinds of percent reductions. Instead, it's to talk about lives saved, because in some cases, NOx may not go up, may not drop much, but SOx goes down, and it all translates into lives saved because of secondary PM formation. The overall benefit is probably in the 5 to 10 to 20 or so lives saved in a region by putting on carbon capture for most plants. And I think that's a better way to talk about it. And we can monetize that into, dollar values as this report does. But I think that's the key to socializing this.
I'll just add one thing that I think as we talk about these, clearly John's analysis is different than ours. Different results, similar yet different. So as we socialize these results and these analyses with folks, we just need to be transparent and honest about what our methodologies are and why we get the outcomes that we do. John and Shannon both mentioned this is not a wholesale, all-inclusive solution to all the challenges and problems that we have. It's just one opportunity to move forward and benefit communities and people. So we don't need to oversell it, but we do need to be honest about what these technologies can do if implemented.
So speaking of nuance, both in communicating about potential co-benefits and having conversations about them, how does that tie back and marry back to the realm of research? If money was no object, if time and human capital and brains to do the research was no object, what would be our next steps? What research is needed in this realm to better understand potential co-benefits, and what would be useful from a community understanding or community conversation perspective. I mean, we know from focus groups and other things, air quality in Louisiana, for example, very top of mind for lots of people. There are different issues, John, as you pointed out, in different communities. But where do we go from here? This was meant as sort of a initial foray into this realm of research?
Well, I think building some off of what John has mentioned, other things that I think community members and certainly we at National Wildlife Federation would be interested to know more about include air toxics and any potential effect on air toxics. Things like mercury and lead, these are huge concerns in a lot of communities, and also concern, especially with regards to mercury, in terms of environmental and wildlife-related contamination and bioaccumulation. Obviously, we've made a lot of progress in this country on reducing both, but still need more. And these are types of pollutants that have particularly harmful and unique, in some ways, health effects on subpopulations like children and pregnant women. So it really has kind of that, again, pernicious, I just keep using that word because it just really fits, sort of lasting effect in a community. I think it'd be good to know more about water quality. Obviously, water is a huge issue, perhaps even in some places more so than air quality for communities. Very concerned about how any new, I think most folks don't know what a solvent is and how it's involved, right, in carbon capture, but to know if there's any potential sort of chemical reactions that might end up with an end result in our local water around these facilities. I think that would be good to investigate and communicate. And then, as you've mentioned, being honest, I think is really important in all of this. This is all very complicated stuff, has some good news to share within there, but there's also some risks, which also you've talked about. So I think, as much as we can kind of highlight and be honest about those risks as well as gaps in information, a lot of what this is just how to communicate about science and the scientific process. I think we all wish that there was sort of a beginning, middle, and end to science so that we would know something once and for all and have final results and then can move forward, but that's obviously, look at climate change science, right? We keep learning all the time. So we have to be able to communicate the fact that while there's still questions to pursue, things to refine, we still do know enough to act and to move forward, and we have a sound foundation on which to build our policies and develop technologies and invest in those technologies. So I think that's an important part of the research context in which we're talking.
I'll just be real brief so we can get to questions, but I think it's important to distinguish what research means in this context. Research isn't really about trying to discover the mechanism of some medicine on the body that's fundamental. It's really compiling what's already out there, because this technology is decades old on capture, and it's compiling it in a way that it makes sense to people. So it's trying to be an honest broker about those emissions that do go up, like VOCs, but it's also just making sure that in communications that the information about co-benefits is there. So that's transparency in permits, making sure that permits actually document the reductions, because not all do. If they don't have to mention this co-benefit, it means when the government does environmental assessments for the environmental impact statement steps, that it includes these co-benefits so that people know about it. And I think those are the kinds of things that are most important.
What say you?
I'll be super brief. We have a list, but money and time are issues. But the reality is there's a lot of things we'd like to learn. We'd like to learn more about the amine solvent products that come out of the process, nitrosamines, things of those nature that we've addressed briefly in our report. As additional capture technologies come online, cryo, membrane, things of that nature, and get to market scale, I'd like to figure out more about how they react and treat co-benefits. The list goes on, but I think that, as Patrice has mentioned and others, this is just the first step, and there's a lot more that we can do and learn.
Well, before we turn to audience questions, when Shannon said communicating about science, my mind immediately went to Bill Nye, the science guy, translated to Matt Fry, the carbon capture guy. What do you guys think? Like TikTok? Yeah. I think so. So on that note, I do want to, I hope everyone's had plenty of coffee and breakfast and your synapses are firing for some questions for our esteemed panelists this morning. Any questions from the audience? Sarah Forbes, we'll get a mic to you. Oh.
Sorry, Sarah, I'm going to go real quick.
Okay.
Curious
Good
what
morning.
you think about the emerging of satellite sensors for real-time monitoring and reporting.
I might have to yield to John.
You too.
But I might need to yield back to the carbon capture guy. I don't have an answer on that.
I don't.
Okay.
Okay, I have one comment and then a question. So my comment is, and maybe you want to speak to this, so it could be a question, but one of the ways that in talking about this, particularly with EJ communities, sometimes I think we need to talk about the reduction in co-pollutants rather than co-benefits. And it may be something that's audience specific, but acknowledging the history of pollution and the fact that this is a reduction in co-pollutants could be effective. My question is, so I've as I think some of you know, I've dug into this issue a little bit over the past couple of years, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts on, monitoring requirements or engineering controls that could be set up to, to avoid some of the emissions with amine systems, particularly the N-amines or the nitrosamines. Thank you.
So I'll just say on the nitrosamines, the challenge we face is that the monitoring equipment, even in pilot testing, is they can't be detected. And depending on what you assume, nitrosamines can have a range of toxicity. And so even at that non-detect level, it would not cause levels of health damage or cancer risk and non-cancer risk that would worry EPA, but it might still be above the background of the plant before adding it on. And it might be a slight increase, but communicating that slight increase, but it's still far less than is a threat, is, I think, a really challenging communication issue, particularly in a community where trust is so low, where they have inherited decades of poor operating experience and other, hiring discrimination and other kinds of things, and yet we're going to go in and say, well, you don't really need to worry about these nitrosamines. I think it's going to be a tough sell in some communities, not all.
I'll add a little bit. I don't know that it's an answer specific to those particular kind of byproducts, but it would sure be great if Congress were to act and to actually require certain levels of co-benefits from the installation of carbon capture technology or perhaps other types of climate solutions. Short of that, and where Congress is just struggling to stay open, then I really, just wanted to say I appreciate so much what DOE is doing with the authority that it has to be able to work into RFIs and other sorts of grant programs and such, and these hubs for DAC and other things, to be able to incorporate into the scoring of kind of who receives what financial assistance, consideration of community benefit plans, as we talked about yesterday, but also, increasingly, I hope in more areas, other co-benefit sort of results from projects, especially when it comes to carbon capture and maybe the demonstration projects that I know are being funded. And in terms of the monitoring piece, I think a lot more could be done in terms of helping communities do their own monitoring, sort of citizen science monitoring. I know that that's already something EPA has done and provided grants to communities to do, and many communities are participating in that. Perhaps more can be done, especially in the context of new sort of retrofits on existing facilities when it comes to carbon capture. And then doing what we can, and perhaps this requires additional appropriations, from Congress, but doing what we can to turn around results from this community monitoring as quickly as possible, so people have that kind of more or less real-time information to be able to base their own actions and advocacy when it comes to kind of speaking up for their needs with local decision makers. Yeah.
Do you have the last word, carbon capture guy?
I'll do my part to keep us on time and just say I agree.
Well, with that, please join me in thanking our esteemed panel this morning for this important but hopefully ongoing conversation around co-benefits. And I think my colleague Diana is going to be coming up to introduce the next panel.